The world is on a knife edge. There's over 100 armed conflicts currently taking place right across the globe. Some of these are new, others have been going on for decades, but each episode will break down everything you need to know to understand the battles shaping the world today. Welcome to the War Zone. I'm Maddie Hale. This week, we are looking at China's determination to dominate the South China Sea and how the country has quietly been occupying various islands and reefs. The South China Sea is one of the most vital economic and environmental regions in the world. China, Brunei, Indonesia, Malaysia, the Philippines, Taiwan and Vietnam all lay claims to parts of the sea. But it's more than just that. 80% of global trade by volume and 70% by value is transported through the South China Sea. 12% of the world's fish catch is operated here. 190 trillion cubic feet of natural gas, 11 billion barrels of oil, as well as 1/3 of all global shipping. To put it simply, China knows how critical this region is for the world and wants to govern most of it. Since 1974, China has occupied the 130 Paracel Islands, 20 of which have outposts on them. But quietly, despite not being the certified occupants of the Spratly Islands, for the past 10 years, China has been busy creating artificial military islands from reefs. Since 2013, China has reclaimed 7 sandbanks, dredging them, creating 3,200 acres of new land and building military fortresses. Take a look at Fiery Cross Island, located in the Spratlys. This is what it looked like in August 2014. 1 month later, satellite photos show the dredging process of building the island. 1 year later, a base was being built. Fast forward to 2022, an entire military base was built, including a concrete runway, observation towers, communication facilities, and shipping ports. And that's the same for 6 other islands that have been built in a region that Taiwan and Vietnam also claim as their territory. So why has China spent the better part of 10 years creating man-made military islands in the South China Sea? And what sort of threat does that pose to the rest of the world? Here to discuss this with me is former US Naval Intelligence Officer Don Bramer. Don, thank you so much for joining me today. As someone who's worked in a presidential administration and as a Navy officer, how do you describe China's determination to control the South China Sea?
First, good morning. What I see what's going on in China is something that we should not be surprised about. This has been a goal of the Chinese Communist Party for as long as I've been alive, for 3 decades. But going back even farther, they have played the long game. They have always seen the United States and the West as an adversary, and they've just been, slowly purchasing parcels of land in the United States, slowly purchasing land across the globe. They see themselves as wanting to regain global dominance that they had many, many centuries ago.
Do you think that this control over the South China Sea is a way to be able to monitor the world's trading movements? Because as I said in the introduction, it's a vital piece of region for not just those Asian areas, but a lot of Western countries rely on the South China Sea for their shipping and their fishing.
Well, I think the perfect example of China's dominance over the world economy we saw during the pandemic. Supply chains in the United States and the West came to a complete halt. Whether it was medical supplies, whether it was glass, whether it was construction supplies, and even medical supplies and pharmaceuticals. The dependence that the West has on China and that region, they were able to control and affect the economy of the globe, forcing people not to be able to go to work, forcing construction projects, hospitals to close. That was a clear example. And if anyone thinks that pandemic wasn't a test for the West, then they're clearly mistaken.
Well, these Spratly Islands, Don, they weren't exactly China's to build on because, Vietnam, Malaysia, Philippines, they all claim that these are their territories as well. Do you think that China just basically took over them because they knew that these countries wouldn't have the power to fight back?
Well, in 2016, the Hague Accord ruled that this was an act of aggression by China. They have what they call the dash line, and that these territories did not belong to China. To counter that, Vietnam has now started building their own set of reefs. I think while it is minuscule next to what China is building, they're almost at 700 acres of their own reef that they're going to use for military platforms. Philippines has given us access to countless bases. So I think we're working together in partnership. The one thing that I think is important for China to understand is while they have business partners, and I say that by Russia, Iran, North Korea, we have allies. And I think that's where the strength and resolve will always come through.
Well, on that note, Don, how critical was that agreement with the Philippines to use their military bases for the United States to have access to that?
I think it was huge. And if you look at, what the Philippines has committed to increase in their own defense budget in the next decade, investing, I think, $8.5 million towards their own defense, which is, may not seem like a lot to the UK or the US, but for a country as small as the Philippines, that's a huge part of their GDP. And I think it shows that they're willing to take the investment that the allies give them and put it to good use and also make that investment themselves.
Some people who aren't following the news or looking closely at what's happening in the South China Sea would be quite surprised to see that China has quietly been building these artificial islands. But would you say that the United States has been closely monitoring this situation, even when you were a Navy officer?
I think we've been monitoring this situation as it grows for many years, but not just the United States. What you see going on with our partnerships with Australia, with Japan, with the UK, the entire region knows what is happening here. And I think that's why our partnerships are so important. Probably, what's going on in South China Sea is why we see AUKUS today, which is a great partnership.
Mm. During this dredging process of actually physically building these islands, it started around 2014 to 2017, were the West countries, the United States, Australia, Japan, all those allies, were they monitoring the situation then and a bit confused as to what was happening?
Well, I think everyone has always known what China's intention is. We've been monitoring this. The big thing is, how do we counter it? How do we counter it with it not seeming like an act of aggression? No one wants a full conflict. So I think it is a strategic game of chess where each side tends to move its pieces little by little, sometimes moving them back, but never wanting to do that checkmate, knowing because it would be horrific for the entire world.
Do you look at these from a military background and think that these artificial islands pose a threat?
Well, they absolutely are a threat. They increase the range of some of the defense systems of China very close to our allies. They bring the range very close to even parts of bases that we have scattered throughout that region. So it is a threat. It needs to be taken seriously, which is why we need to increase our partnership with Australia, for example. I've mentioned AUKUS before, which is a tremendous partnership between Australia, the United Kingdom, and the United States, allowing us to share intelligence, to share technology, and also increase our undersea capabilities.
Mm. What do you make of claims that these islands were purely built for navigational safety? In the situation that there is a plane needing to land in the South China Sea, China claimed that these military islands that they've man-made are a good spot to be able to basically fly into and be safe, but they're actually just military bases. Do you think that this was kind of just a way to brush off, the fear of threat from Western countries?
I apologize for a smirk, but if anyone knows the way that the Chinese Communist Party operates, they are masters at controlling propaganda, and they are masters at controlling social media. So anything that they say, you have to take with a grain of salt and know that it's probably not even close to being a half-truth.
Don, the main military advantage the United States has over China is its air superiority and the ability to use that if and when it would have to defend Taiwan. But these military islands that China built, do you think that they've changed the game in that air power arena?
I think they've changed the game but not from an overall standpoint. I think the game has changed because it changes the way that you think your strategy. Knowing that your adversary has one set of tools just forces you to rethink how you're going to perform your own strategy. And the thing about it is, the United States and our allies, uh, while China has, the manpower, we have an increased and a massive amount of technology that allows us to stay one step ahead. While we may be a little slower in building our ships because they can build them faster than us, what we do have is technology, and you know, our ships, our planes are far more advanced than anything that they can put in the air or at sea.
But in the event that China does decide to invade Taiwan, and anyone who's across the conflict would know that the United States would be there in a moment's notice to help defend Taiwan, do you think that the CCP is basically using these military islands to gear up to be able to launch these fighter jets, be able to launch these cruise missiles in a moment's notice?
I think they're building these islands to kind of assert themselves. We've allowed, and by saying we, I mean the West and the U.S., has allowed China to basically run amok for the last 4 years, especially because they don't feel that the world is in a position to hurt them. They don't see that there's a huge risk. They can do whatever they want. They're like the bad bully on the block that who's going to tell them no? So they keep doing what they're going to do. They keep pushing that line farther and farther out into the ocean to see what happens next. And then when they feel like it gets a little testy, then they come back. It's always going to be a test, and I think we need strong leadership here in the United States, here across the globe with the UK and our allies, to make sure that we work together as allies and not allow China to have free will.
Don, it's estimated that China's defence budget this year is around $471 billion. They're doubling that. They doubled it since 2022, I think. But how much of this money do you think would have been dedicated to building these artificial islands and stocking them out with these military gear?
Well, that's an increase just in 1 year of 7.1%. And for people who try to fathom what 471 million looks like and how it would compare, that is about half of what the United States defense budget is, even though the GDP for the China is only about 2/3 of what the United States is. So put into comparison that they're putting a lot of their resources to their defense. And part of that's because they have a labor force that they don't really have to sustain very well in paying them a fair wage. They can operate a shipyard, for example, that one day can build a frigate, the next day can build a freighter. So they don't have that separation by being a communist nation. We need to take that in consideration and understand that it is a threat. We need to redefine how we think manufacturing and construction of our own technology, and we need to invest in our own workforce so that we can become a true adversary, not only technology-wise, but also in the manufacturing sphere.
Are you aware of what kind of military portfolio is on these islands? Are they storing missiles or even nuclear weapons? I know that there's about 5,000 troops, soldiers and officers that are deployed in the area.
So the bulk of what we've seen, on these islands is small batteries of surface-to-air missiles, some, troops quite a bit, and aircraft. So because of the depth of the islands, and you look at the size, it's really hard to store any large armaments. So it would be, surface-to-air missile systems, batteries such as that, and troops, and smaller aircraft. Runways take, larger planes take larger runways. So things that they can get off the ground fast in small squadrons.
Don, how has the United States' military adapted to China's growing presence in the South China Sea? Has the Navy had to deploy more troops or vessels out in the region?
We have, and not just the United States, but all of our allies. Protecting the shipping lanes and keeping them open and free and safe for commercial goods, commercial vessels to traverse all the way across the ocean and get to their ports of call, so we can keep a supply chain open. That's a threat. The supply chain is the biggest threat. If you close down the world's economy, it doesn't matter how strong your military is. It doesn't matter how strong your fighting force is. If you can't take care of your people and you can't feed them, then you become a weak nation very fast.
Don, there's speculation and some information circulating that these man-made artificial islands are actually eroding because it's obviously unnatural to be building huge islands out of sandbanks. Have you heard any of that from any Navy sources?
Well, they're very poorly and hastily made. So, as they continue to build them, they continue to erode. One of the biggest, I guess, ecological or environmental dangers that I see here is all of this dredging creates these large sand clouds in the ocean, for lack of a better word. And while China controls the supply chain, now they're having a huge effect on our food chain. And, and actually where a lot of fishermen, a lot of people in the Chinese demographic who use fishing, oystering to sustain their life, now that's being affected where they're suffocating the wildlife and the maritime lifestyle that you have there in that region.
Well, on that note, do you think that China should somehow be penalised for wiping out something like over 4.5 acres of the reef ecosystem?
I think that you can call it a penalty, you can call it whatever you will, but it's kind of like if you find somebody, $100, but they don't have $100 to give, or they won't give it, what good is a fine? And I think that anything that we would do would be, it would be good publicity. It would make the headlines, but would they actually feel the effects of a penalty? And I think China's too arrogant to feel like they would turn it around in propaganda that would just, poke fun at the West and the United States.
Don, just finally, what do you think the likelihood is that the United States will eventually go into war in the South China Sea, especially with such conflict brewing between China and Taiwan?
There's always that possibility, and while none of us have that magic 8-ball, I'd like to think that stronger minds will prevail. A conflict in the South China Sea would be devastating, not only to that region, but most likely to the globe. And I don't think that's something that anyone wants. There can be a lot of posturing. There can be a lot of threats, name calling, saber rattling, if you will. But I truly hope that we don't get there. And I think that's where, the West, the United States, and the world need strong leadership, and to not rely on what polls and social media says, but actually sit down at the table and have good adult educated conversations.
Don Bramer, former US intelligence officer, thank you so much.
Thank you, Maddie.